questions. So please ask questions, but you have to use the chat box to do that. We have muted everyone because we are recording this series. So if you got a question, do not use the question and answer box. Please use the chat box. We monitor that at all times. And as I said, please, we really like questions, and attendees really appreciate the activity as well. A quick shout out to our sponsors, Cummins, one of the top backup generator manufacturers in the world, PenCat, longtime partner of Exergy in critical power systems, not only in backup and resiliency, but if you need clean quality power, PenCat are the guys to go to. Hitachi has been supportive of us and our customers in providing financing for all sorts of things. RPG Energy Group has been a longtime partner with Exergy, and we appreciate their support. And last but not least is Energy Storage Development Partners. And I want to put a big shout out to Chet Lyons, founder of Energy Storage Development Partners, who's joining us today mostly to keep me out of trouble and probably keep me from saying things that are wrong. Chet is renowned in the industry and is a sought after speaker and writer on all things energy storage. So this is only a 30-minute presentation, so let's get started. Quick and dirty, what does Exergy do? So Exergy is a simple, easy to use, and I'm going to call it market platform. We're a little bit like Amazon in a sense. If you're a municipality or you're a business and you want to be green, and when I say green, 100% green, you want to be resilient, 100% resilient, the grid goes down, you keep running, and you want to save money, then just come to us, you subscribe to the service, no long-term commitments, it's easy, brainless, and you become green, resilient, and save money. What we promised everybody in this webinar series is that we would teach you how to do what we do. It's the do-it-yourself approach. Now, we've got it all built, it's all automated, all those great things, but again, we're here to explain how to do it yourself. Today, we're talking about how to get a free battery. And like every webinar so far, we're going to break it into three pieces, and that is value stacking, and then what really are the realistic savings that we can expect, and then economics and geography and how that plays. Now, as I said, this is the fourth in our series. Last week was the comparison of batteries versus backup generators, primarily focused on backup. The week before that was how to get a free backup generator. So if you've got questions from today, we recommend you go back to that one. There's a lot of similarities between the two. But I got to be totally candid. I sort of misrepresented it a little bit. Free doesn't mean that some company is going to give you a free battery, okay? What it does mean is that this webinar is how to use a battery intelligently, or how to use a battery to make a profit. Now, I've got a big disclaimer here in red. Using a battery to make a profit basically makes it unavailable to be a backup. And the reason is you're not sure the state of charge because you never know when the grid might be going down. So if you're using the battery for something else like demand response or peak shaving or something like that, and the grid goes down, you don't have a backup anymore. So for this analysis, and again, if you're not really sure, go to last week's webinar on batteries versus backup. But you can't use a battery or rely on a battery as a backup source if you're going to use it to try and make a profit. Now, batteries are in the news all the time, and they're in the news all the time, one, because they're sexy, the cost is declining, they're going to be the savior of the grid and how we integrate more renewables and all that. But conceptually, you can think of a battery, as the Swiss Army knife. It can do lots and lots of different things, which is really great. But you've always got to remember that you can only use one tool at a time. And that's also true about batteries. Now, if you read all of the market literature these days, they'll talk about stacking of values, how there's all these, it's the Swiss Army knife again, all these different blades, all these different tools generate revenue and profit, and you get to stack them all up. any one item might not be enough to justify the battery, but if you put them all together and stack them up, you'll basically get there. Well, first, I have a little bit of a conceptual problem with the idea of stacking. And it may be just because I'm an engineer and I look at stacked things and they all exist at the same time. Essentially, if each one of those is a profit thing, it's like I have multiple ways of generating profit all at the same time. And that's really not the way this works. It really is, you get the guy standing in the middle of decision world, right? Every minute of the day, you've got a battery, you have to decide that next minute, what am I using it for? Am I going to use it for demand response? Am I going to use it for peak shaving? Am I going to use it for PLC management? And be able to forecast out the grid's pricing, the load, your load, in every combination, essentially every minute of the day, because it's a decision at each point in time. So I don't agree with stacking from the standpoint of they all occur simultaneously. They do not. You have to decide which one you're going for at any one point in time. That doesn't mean you don't change. You may say, hey, I'm doing arbitrage, and then the market changes, an hour later, and you may change your strategy. But it's the constant sort of forecasting and strategic view that you have to use. So getting back to the Swiss Army knife, batteries have lots of tools or lots of blades like the Swiss Army knife. And Chet, I'm going to ask you to help me here on a bunch of these. We've got energy arbitrage. We've got frequency regulation, spin and non-spinning reserves, voltage support, black start, resource adequately, distribution deferral, transmission congestion relief, transmission deferral, time of use bill management, increased photovoltaic, solar self-consumption, demand charge reduction, and backup power. Now, I took this right out of, I think it was an NREL report. Now, just to clarify, I don't include backup power here. And our analysis is if you're doing a battery for other profit things, you're not going to use it for backup power. So what we've got here are 13 different value streams potentially available to your battery if you've got a battery. And it's like, how do you put all these value streams together in order to make money? So let's take it from the standpoint, what's really feasible? So Chet, if you can get online with me here, I'd really appreciate it. So
I'm with you, Dave.
Thank you, Chet. So of the 13, let's start out. Energy arbitrage, it's pretty simple. It means you buy low and you kind of sell high. So when the grid's cheap, you charge it up, and when the grid's expensive, you use it or something like that. When I looked back at those stacks, though, Chet, that frequency regulation, voltage support, spin and non-spinning reserves and things were pretty attractive, but why is it not really feasible for a behind-the-meter, let's say, commercial and industrial battery? Can they get those values?
Well, it's a little tough because we take the case of energy arbitrage. So, in a particular area, you could buy low at night, say, and either sell during the day or just use it to offset your own usage. That will work in some cases. If you do that, that likes a power to energy ratio that is low, like 1 to 4. But if you were to do frequency regulation, that's a much shorter time frame balancing service. That actually likes a power to energy ratio that is the opposite, 4 to 1. So the difference between 1 to 4 and 4 to 1 is actually quite a gap. So, once you optimize the battery for one of these, depending upon which ones you're comparing, it just may not work very well on that side. Also, a couple of these, frequency regulation, spin and non-spin, those are really kind of transmission related applications. That kind of takes you into a different world. So when you enter the resource into the ISO's energy management system, you have to pay attention to the requirements for that. Voltage support is really something pretty different altogether. Black start is typically it's a bilateral contract that you have to negotiate with the local LSC, the local interconnection utility.
Yeah, for those
So
of you that don't know what
yeah,
black start is, if the grid goes down, generators need a source of electricity in order to literally get started up again and resync. So it's called a black start, meaning you've got to bring some other generator. It's typically, diesel or natural gas or something to start up so you can start your other generators. It's very difficult for a battery behind the meter to do black start, because if the grid went down, in most cases you would island. There's no way for you to do a black start, and it's just too small. You're on the distribution end behind the meter. There's just not enough oomph there to get the grid started again. Sorry, Chet, I interrupted you.
No. I think I said just about everything I had to contribute. I'd go back to your original statement, which when you divided the 13 different applications across the 3 different jurisdictions in the earlier slide, what the proponents of value stacking typically ignore is that the benefits in each of those areas fall to different jurisdiction partners. They don't all consolidate to the owner. But the lab guys, the science guys at NREL and Sandia, they kind of ignore that on that side. They're great, but they don't follow that particular limitation.
So in some cases, it's if you wanted to value stack, you literally have to negotiate with 3 or 4 parties for those values, and they're different parties and different requirements. And then also for some of them, it gets very, very expensive. So if you wanted to do frequency regulation, which is primarily a transmission oriented thing, that's expensive. You need a pretty big piece of iron to justify just the registration costs, I would assume.
Yeah, that's right. I wouldn't do it if I had less than 10 megawatts. The transaction costs are just a real pain on it. And also, when you get into the details of any one of these, when you really get into the fine points of the dispatch algorithms and requirements for frequency regulation, just to pick one, they're pretty tedious. All of these are fairly different. So you have to be pretty darn knowledgeable to be able to tackle all these things. And they kind of, they overlap and they kind of cross-cancel in a lot of cases.
So Chet, am I fair in my statement here? From 13 stacked values, there's probably 4 that really constitute, if not 100%, at least the vast majority of where the value generation is going to be for a behind the meter battery.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got it. I looked ahead in the slides and you're exactly right.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, so similar to our free backup generator, how do you make money with a battery? So there are these 5 things: energy arbitrage, demand response, PV self-consumption, peak load contribution, and peak shaving. So let's start with energy arbitrage. Now, energy arbitrage is really, at its essence, really, really simple, right? We know that energy prices at 2 a.m. in the morning are low, and at 7 p.m. in the evening can be quite high. So you can charge the battery at 2 in the morning and use it at 7 p.m., and that's buy low, avoid high prices. But it gets a little tricky on this. And this has to do, and again, certain jurisdictions, et cetera. For me to be able to make money in an energy arbitrage, I have to buy low and I have to avoid the price when it's high, right? Which means I have to go from a standard fixed tariff structure where I'm paying the same amount per kilowatt hour regardless of when those kilowatt hours are consumed. And I have to go on what's called the index, or I have to become a wholesale buyer, right? Because if I'm a wholesale buyer, I can buy low and then use the energy when it was high. But if I have a fixed tariff, that doesn't work for me. So now why it gets tricky is you now have price risk if you go on the index or you're buying wholesale. So let's take a look at that. Energy prices, electricity prices are quite volatile. They bounce around a lot. Somebody's got to pay for that risk. And under the standard tariff, you basically are paying for that risk. You're going to pay more to get a flat rate, and the utility that's providing it, they get the benefit when it's, the cost is low. They have to pay it when it's high, but you're essentially subsidizing that. And, and on average, if you were to go from your standard tariff to an index product or go to wholesale, on average, you would save money, about 20% on your energy cost by just going to an index product. Here's the issue with that, is that here are the pricing in 4 of the largest ISOs in the United States. Notice how volatile these prices are. So if you go on the index so that you're buying low and then essentially you're avoiding high, it now becomes a risk to you of how long is it going to remain high. So maybe if I have a 1-hour battery and I charge it for 1 hour at 2 a.m. and I use it for 1 hour at 7 p.m., that's great. But if the price is still high at 8 p.m., it really doesn't buy me much. If it's still high at 9 p.m., it doesn't buy me much. So the exposure you have to those large price swings that could, be there for a sustained period of time gives you essentially a financial risk. Now, we are not in the business of being utilities, et cetera, et cetera. We're in the business of whatever it is the company is that we do. We're not a power company. We make a product. We service people, things like that. We really want predictability. And predictability tends to work fine with the standard tariff, but you're paying more. With going on the index, you can bring your overall costs down, but your predictability goes out the window. You can have like a really bad quarter, really bad month, depending upon what the energy prices are doing. This is one of the key differentiators between a backup generator, which can run literally days and weeks on end, and a battery, which just has a short period of charge for it. So yes, arbitrage works, but you have to structure your basic tariff in order to take advantage of it. And that can increase your risk. So you have to be very, very careful. The other way to do this is doing demand response. And if you go back a slide or two, it says you have to decide what your battery is. Is your battery a generator or is your battery a curtailment? Because how you play the market is very different. And in some of the jurisdictions, a battery can't be both a generator and a curtailment device, meaning that if I want to demand respond, I have to use the battery and register it as a curtailment service, which means I can only ever use the battery to offset some of my load or all of my load, but I can never export it to the grid. So you now have to understand which way you want to play. If you want to export to the grid because you're going to, store low and sell high, and maybe your company doesn't use electricity during when prices are high, so you want to store it low and then sell it high, you'd have to register that as a generator. And if you register it as a generator, then you can't use it for demand response. And demand response tends to be a better deal because the grid is essentially paying you the high price to go away. But you need to understand it. In the demand response game, you play it in 2 ways. One is the day ahead market. So I charge up at night and I bid in the next morning for let's say I bid in Thursday morning for Friday, and I'd say, I'm willing to take this much load off the grid for this period of time. And that load and time is the size of your battery. and you give it a price. So you may have charged it at 3 cents and you'd say, hey, if you pay me 5 cents, I will reduce my load by that amount of the battery. And if the grid likes that, they send you what's called a dispatch authorization, and you program it into your battery controller and say, hey, tomorrow at 7 p.m., turn on for an hour and then essentially turn off. That's the day ahead market. And for the vast majority of demand response, it's typically transacted through the day ahead. The real-time market is basically, as it says, you're watching the grid continuously during the day and watching the prices bounce around. You've got a battery that's got charged. You charged it late last night at 2 a.m. and you're watching the price bounce around, and you say, okay, I'm going to now request a real-time dispatch. I want to demand respond in real time. The real interesting thing there is, what's the analysis? How do you forecast? So if it's at 7 p.m. and my price is at 10 cents, do I do it at 7 p.m. at 10, but what if it's 11 cents at 8 o'clock or 15 cents at 9 o'clock? Well, I'd rather wait till 9 o'clock and get the 15 cents. So I don't demand respond at 7, I wait till 9 and something happens and I don't know, weather changes, we got a big storm comes through, temperature drops, and the price never got to 15 and got down to 8. So in the real-time market, you really, really have to be watching. You have to be extremely good at forecasting what the market is going to do to optimize. And you're never sure. You literally are never sure. PV self-consumption. This is pretty straightforward. I've got solar. Solar generates during the day. I could net meter that, and I've got excess energy. Early net metering was pretty nice in the sense it was basically just spinning your meter backwards, and you got the same offset, including many times distribution charges and things like that. With the proliferation of behind the meter solar, net metering has really changed, and in many cases it's now based on the time of use pricing. So when you generate that excess solar and essentially you're selling it to the grid, what's the grid price? They're not going to offset your retail bill. They're going to offset what their alternative cost of generation is. So that's time of use pricing or wholesale pricing. That can be very, very substantial reduction in the value of your solar. So if I pick in, let's take California and the duck curve. Right? In the middle of the day, this is the net load on the grid. In the middle of the day, when sun's shining, there's so much solar in Southern California, just go negative. So if you're now net metering on a time of use or a wholesale price game, you literally are paying somebody to take your energy because prices are so low. And therefore really no great value or any value to you at all. By having a battery, you store that energy when the prices are low. And then of course, when the sun goes down and all the solar comes off and now the grid has got to respond, just look at the ramp. The prices then come roaring back high. And that's the time that you're going home, right? You're going to go home, you're going to turn your air conditioning on and get the kids ready for bed or whatever the case may be. There, the prices are going to be high. That's the time you want to use the battery. So PV self-consumption is a great value for using solar and battery. Again, how much you make on it is really the question of how big is the difference between the trough of the duck curve and the mountain at the early evening. But it, in fact, absolutely does. Most cases, the real value of a battery and paying for itself is in managing your peak demand. Now, this gets a little complicated. Apologies for that. It's peak demand. We're breaking into two pieces. The first one is the peak load contribution. And this is I'm going to call it a tax. This is a cost assessed by the transmission side of the world here, because they got to pay for the transmission and generation infrastructures, the wires, the poles, and all that kind of stuff. And the way they do that is they allocate those costs to you based upon how much load you have on the grid during a small number of peak hours. And when I say small number, I mean a small number. In PJM, what you pay next year in your demand charges is based on 5 hours of this year when the grid was under its most stress and its highest load. 5 hours determines all your demand charges for the next year. ERCOT, which is Texas, it's 4 hours, but it's 4 hours, 1 hour per month for 4 specific months. New England, New York, MISO, which is the Chicago area, 1 hour a year determines your demand charge for the next year. So the goal, the strategy here that you want to do is during the time that the grid is saying, this is the reference hour, you want to have your battery on. The problem is you don't know when that hour is going to happen. It could, there are forecasts, which is great, and say, we think this this coming hour is going to be the hour, and you wait and you turn your generator on. But if you miss it, then you have a real issue because you've missed that hour. And just to give an example, in ERCOT, there were 3 hours contiguously in the same day that were forecasted to be the max. So at 2 o'clock, this is the max. And then at 3 o'clock, oh no, this is the max. And then 4 o'clock, oh no, this is going to be the max. So if you turned your battery on at 2 and you only had a 1 hour battery, you're sort of screwed on that one. So it's a game of probabilities because you got limited amount of storage. Again, the difference between a backup and a battery. The backup generator can run for hours and hours, days and days, weeks and weeks. Because your battery's got a limited storage, if you miss that hour, you either better have a much, much bigger battery to catch the next hour, or you're going to miss it. So you need to accurately guess what hour is going to be the basically getting at least for that one, which means, at least in our statistical analysis, you need to forecast within 1 or 2% of the actual grid number at that time. And I'll tell you, we've looked at very sophisticated models, neural nets, artificial intelligence. That is a really, really tough margin to get right. So what's your probability of getting it right? It's really quite small. It's very, very small if you just have a 1 hour battery. If you got a 2 hour battery, your odds get better. 3 hour battery, your odds get even better. 4 hour battery, your odds get even better. The problem is that the value is only created by hitting that 1 hour. So if you have a 4 hour battery, the other 3 hours are an insurance product essentially, but it just costs you a lot more. And they don't really contribute to the value generated in the peak demand. So if you want to do it, you can do it. It's the probability of getting it right. Just as a quick and dirty here, we took a look at ERCOT, which is Texas, which has 4 PLCs. And this was for a specific customer. And if it was a 1 hour battery, they have to hit 2 out of 4 to make the battery financially viable to actually work. If you only got 1 out of 4, nothing, you lost money. If you got more than 2, fantastic, but you've got to get at least 2. Now, if you add a larger battery, your probability of getting the 2 goes up. That's great, but your cost also went up. So the curve is similar, but it's actually just shifted down somewhat. Again, I hate to harp on it, but it's really, it's like a casino. It's really about what is the probability, how well can you forecast. Now, that's peak load contribution. That's what the transmission system is putting on you, and it's done with a very few number of hours per year, or as little as 1 hour a year. Peak shaving or peak demand at your local level is different. This is your local distribution company. So this is the ones that, literally do the last mile, wires to your location and things like that. They don't do this based on 1 or a few hours of last year. They do it typically on a 15 to 30 minute window. And it's the highest load you had during any of those 15 or 30-minute windows in a month. Now, typically it resets a month. There are stations in the country, they play a really, really nasty game called ratcheting, where this month's peak demand remains, if it is, as long as it is higher than the next month's and the next month, it remains the peak demand for 1 year, but it will ratchet up. So if next month you got a higher peak demand, then it ratchets up to that one for the next 11 months until you have, passed it through. So the idea here is you want to use the battery in order to reduce those peaks. Well, again, this is the probability game. It's like, how well can I forecast the peaks? How regular are those peaks? And are they significant? So I just took a load profile here, and I'd say, okay, if I was going to shave the peak off of this, what would I do? Well, I could say, like, I want to go from the 22 to 14, that top peak. And that, and if I'm going to try and get it all the way down there, I'm going to need a battery that's going to last at least 6 hours or so. If I don't get the 6 hours, then my peak demand is going to be 18 at that 14th hour, right? So you need to really understand how your load works. Do you have things that are, certain times during the week, certain times during the day where you've got a relatively short-term spike that is to have higher demand charges than you need? You can use your battery to do that. The corollary is one spike, one small battery, I can reduce my demand charge. If my load is flat and I put the same demand all the time, a battery isn't going to save me anything. There's just no way, there's nothing to shave in that side. So your battery in this case needs to be big enough or it's going to have little effect. So if I only had that sort of like 1 hour battery in this context, I could be able to move it down from 22 to 18, but I couldn't get any lower than that because I've already used up the battery. If I missed calling that load at time 8 and waited until hour 9 because I just forecasted it wrong or something like that, then the battery provides no value at all because I've already set my peak end at hour. So lastly, we just wanted to put this in because we did this in our last one. What about solar and a battery? Not just battery, but we have solar and a battery. You know what? This actually can work. Now, I want to remind everyone, this is not a backup, okay? If the sun's not shining, the battery doesn't get charged, and if the grid goes down and you don't have a charged battery, you're not going to work. But we wanted to look at it on an average basis, that if I had enough solar that I could essentially store during the middle of the day and then use it at the end of the day or through the night, would that work? And in this case, and I think we did this one also based sort of on an average United States, this is not only energy arbitrage, but this is using that battery to knock those demand charges down. This is what's key. We're essentially charging enough, we have a big enough battery to run for, maybe it's 12 hours a day or 16 hours a day. If you can do that, you basically could get this thing to pencil out for you if you're currently paying about 15 cents a kilowatt hour. And that actually is true in some places of the country where it actually does work that way. So quick and dirty, if you look at it from, what do you need in payback years? If you wanted 1 year payback, you'd have to have 20 cents a kilowatt hour. If you have a 5-year payback, you could get down to maybe, 13 and a half, 14 cents a kilowatt hour, and it would work for you. But again, it will not be a backup generator. So quick and dirty, how to get a free battery. First, you need to be in the deregulated markets. You need ones with high energy prices. You need ones with high demand charges that you can hit and, and essentially knock the demand charge down. And you want ones with incentives. From our analysis right now, that's the list of states that are most attractive. and mostly because of the statistics also in hitting the demand charges. You need to be in markets with high peak demand charges. That's the key, but you need to hit at least 50% of those, and you want something that has, or a market that has, high price volatility. And the reason is that's where your arbitrage and demand response comes in. So can you get a free battery? Yes, you can. There are a number of states in the United States where behind the meter battery will pay for itself primarily through demand charge reduction and some demand response. However, it is in fact very much of a casino situation. Is you've got to pick when to turn it on given where the demands are and things like that. And if you miss it, you sort of lose on that. Thank you so much. I think we're at our 30 minutes here. David, do we have questions?
We sure do. In fact, we got one here that asks, can you elaborate on areas where the local utility, like in Puerto Rico's PREPA, does not have a classic demand charge like some of the utilities on the mainland?
That don't have a demand charge.
Right. I guess they're offering to also send a bill if that helps, but I'm guessing the question has to do with their purely energy pricing with no demand charges.
I honestly don't. I do know that in some areas where, like in the Caribbean and things, they don't have demand charges because they have, hundreds of diesel generators running and they just put more on or off or something like that. And it's all based on an energy charge. In general, and I do apologize, we don't look for places that don't have demand charges because otherwise the economics aren't particularly good for what we do. Chet, do you know of any areas where there's no demand charges?
Well, there are a bunch that have, flat rates with no demand charges, but most of North America has utility tariffs that do have demand charges. But in the case of Puerto Rico and PREPA, I don't recall what the cents per kilowatt hour is, but I believe it's actually quite high. So in that case, one of the applications that you reviewed, the self-consumption application, that provided you can get some solar in there, that could work potentially, very well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Dave, another question.
Yeah, another question is, you focus mostly on markets that are deregulated. How do batteries work in comparison in regulated markets on the mainland?
The reason we focus on deregulated markets is the ability to do things like demand respond. That's very difficult to do in a regulated market because there's no open market transactions for it. And it's a bilateral negotiation with the utility in which you don't have a whole strong hand in. It still works fine if you are still subject to large demand charges and things like that. But for us, we focus on the deregulated markets just because of our business model in general.
Great, and it looks like that is it on the questions from our end. So I'll hand it back to you, Dave, to end.
Thank you. Chet, thanks so much for joining today. Really appreciate your insight and vast knowledge on this. So to sum it up, everybody, yes, you can get a battery to pay for itself. It's a little tricky, but we can, certainly go through it again if you're interested. But I do want to stress and remind you, if you're using a battery for making activities, it is not going to be available. You cannot count on it for backup. So from a strategic perspective, you have to ask yourself, what is it that you're trying to achieve? If you're trying to achieve, let's say, just a reduction in your overall energy costs, and you've got solar and you want to be greener and things like that, a battery can certainly play into that. If your goal is resiliency and you want to be green and resilient, then we would tend to push you, I shouldn't say push you, a backup generator, natural gas backup generator, is a much, much better way to go. Because if you need to be continue running for days, weeks on end, then you need something which is, essentially fuel oriented in that direction. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. As I said, this was the 4th in our series of 8. Coming up next week, Dave, I think it's behind the meter solar, isn't it?
Yep. Does it make sense?
Yeah. So, and again, we do have a tendency to do controversial things. So if you're a commercial or industrial company, does behind the meter solar or rooftop solar make sense for you if you want to be green, or are there alternative ways of doing it in front of the meter? And this has to do, again, with tariff charges and demand charges and how those things work. So hope to see you here next week, and thanks so much for joining. Have a great day.
Thanks, Dave and Dave.